His family buried his body in 1944. 20 years later, the phone rang. A small living room, 1964. A coal stove hisses. A photograph in a cracked frame leans against a lamp. A young man in a uniform, his grin half hidden by frost on the collar. The telephone sits on a side table, black and round, untouched for 2 decades. When it rings, the sound cuts the silence like a question. But to understand why that ring can break a life built on certainty, we must go back to December 1944, to a January white field in the Ardennes, and to a different kind of noise. The cough of engines dying, the dull clink of metal, the smell of gasoline under freezing air. December 17, 1944. Near a village called Hansfeld, an advance element found something that did not belong in that winter's bleakness. A pile of jerry cans and drums, stacked and abandoned, the scales so large it looked like a small enemy depot. Soldiers counted and engineers estimated. The stock amounted to roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel. For men already short of the most basic necessities, the site was at first a private kind of salvation. Oil for engines, warmth for generators, life for the teeth of a stalled offensive. A historian's voice explains the significance without melodrama. In the winter of 1944, the war in Western Europe was as much about liquid as it was about men. An army needs movement, and movement needs fuel. For Germany, fuel scarcity had become a strategic choke point. For the Allies, a threefold supply effort: fuel pipelines under the Channel, a relentless truck convoy system along newly cleared roads, and the capacity of the American industrial engine meant an abundance that could be measured in millions of gallons. The discovery at Hansfeld, then, was not the turning of a single tide. It was a splash in an ocean of supply that already ran far wider and deeper than the German planners had anticipated. Archival reports list Hansfeld plainly: a captured stockpile of roughly 50,000 gallons. Interrogation testimony and intelligence briefs from the period indicate that German units, advancing with the confidence of desperation, expected relief in such finds. But what they met, in many places, was a more complicated reality. At Stavelot and at other depots discovered across the Ardennes and the Low Countries, engineers and supply officers made decisions with the cold arithmetic of denial. Millions of gallons were set alight or otherwise rendered unusable rather than allowed to fall intact into enemy hands. The result was a battlefield where black smoke stitched the winter sky into a moral and strategic paradox. The Allies could burn their own abundance to keep it from changing the course of the war. On a frost-splintered morning at Hansfeld, a patrol officer remembered the first impression was one of disbelief. Here, in the hollow of Europe's winter, sat more fuel than a small division might use in weeks.
The men lifted can after can, passed them down rows of tired arms, and tried to imagine supply lines long enough to justify such stores. For a few hours, the captured jerry cans spoke of possibility. For the Germans who found them, they spoke of a chance to keep moving. Yet the larger story was already in motion. The Allies were no longer dependent on local seizures for their advance. A network of supply, long, expensive, and hidden in maps and telephone lines, was pushing forward. Pipelines that crossed waters to bring petrol to the continent, truck convoys that ran under banners and through night, and depots that could, in aggregate, hold what a nation could manufacture. In the calculus of the front, a single captured depot could change a platoon's day, but not the strategic momentum. It could be a blessing, or it could be a trap, especially when fuel that could have helped an enemy was instead denied by fire. In the village cemetery that same month, another scene closed with finality. A family gathered under a gray chapel roof. Snow lay along the graves like a soft wrongness. They had received the telegram weeks earlier: killed in action. The word arrived in the clipped sentences of military form. It named a familiar man, but it carried the removes of bureaucracy and war. In the chapel, the minister spoke of courage. Outside, neighbors brought spare shovels and peat moss. They wrapped the man in the modest rituals of the time. They did what families had always done, when the world offered no other way to mark a loss. They buried a body
they would never see again. This family story must be told with care and with a single necessary caution. The personal arc you are about to hear is a fictionalized composite created to represent the countless individual costs of the winter campaign. The names, the house, the intimate conversations are dramatized. The historical facts and quoted archival material presented in this program are drawn from documented sources. The fictional elements exist to explore what numbers and maps alone cannot. The interior life of absence, the slow architecture of grief, the social compromises that follow a presumed death. The widow, because she would need a name for the mind to hold, we will call her Anna, stood at the grave with gloves gone thin from use. She had been 19 when the man left. He had been a brother, then a sweetheart, then husband. In the months after, neighbors brought coal. A cousin helped fix the leaky roof. Letters stopped arriving. The government sent a death certificate and a folded flag. In their small kitchen, by a stove that would not know his hands, Anna kept his photograph near a plate she never cleared. It was not that she wanted to keep him in the past, so much as that the past had nowhere else to go.
Back on the road outside Hansfeld, the captured fuel did not change the larger truth of the Ardennes. The German spearhead, pushing like a hand through thin cloth, was throttled by its inability to sustain itself. Men abandoned tanks that would not drink the fuel. Engines stopped mid-advance, and maintenance became a luxury they could not afford. Vehicles sat like strange machines in the snow, hunks of iron and bolt on a white field, monuments not to victory but to miscalculation. The dramatic irony was cruel. Engines idle because there was no gasoline, while elsewhere fuel burned in controlled fires to deny it to those very engines. An intelligence officer later wrote that German columns, when they met American supply convoys and heard the endless din of tanks and trucks, registered more than fear. They were astonished. It was not only the size of the force, it was the supply behind it, the sense that an enemy's war might be fed from an industrial heart that refused to be starved. These observations come from post-war interrogations and from logs kept by quartermasters. They present a sober picture. War is often decided less by the heroics of small units than by the arithmetic of pipelines, storage, and roadbeds. Consider the image of a convoy, a string of trucks, headlights dowdy against snow, tires eating salt and mud. Each truck is not simply transport, it is an artery. Break enough arteries and the body falls apart. For the Germans in 1944, the arteries were already compromised by limited access to oil fields, Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants, shortages of transport, and the ever-increasing drag of defending ground on multiple fronts. Finding a single depot of American fuel in a Belgian field could feel miraculous, but when the larger system favored the other side, miracles were fragile things. The documentary voice pauses to give proportion. Historians have catalogued the burned depots, Stavelot among them, where enormous columns of smoke rose and left the sky blackened with denial. The decision to destroy stock was often agonized. Commanders weighed the immediate tactical value to an Allied force against the long-term moral and strategic consequence of letting that material be used by an enemy. Allied engineers and commanders chose, in many instances, to render their abundant stores unusable rather than risk them turning the tide in pockets of the offensive that might briefly profit from the windfall. A simulated soldier's breath fogs the air in a dramatized moment. We thought we'd found salvation. For a second it seemed like luck, he remembers, and an imagined voice that stands in for many real ones. But the voice is careful to be framed as dramatization, a window into how soldiers might have felt when their desperation met a logistical reality beyond their comprehension. By January, units across the Ardennes reported immobilization not from bullets, but from an absence no cartridge could replace: fuel.
Collapsed supply meant stalled evacuation of the wounded, the inability to move artillery, the loss of tactical initiative. Hospitals could not shuttle patients. The winter amplified logistics into life and death. Men who might have been saved in other circumstances died in the snow because there was no vehicle to carry them, no engine to power a generator. At home, in the months that followed, Anna negotiated with forms and local committees. The community depended on rituals, a memorial evening, a wreath, a place in the parish ledger. The state provided a small pension that eased the immediate need for coal and medicines, but it could not fill the gap of an absent voice at dinner or the missing footprint on the threshold. Children, if there were any, learned to interpret the house around the absence, to treat the empty chair as an object rather than a person. Grief, in the long run, becomes habit. Habits harden into truth. To neighbors, the man was dead. To Anna, the deadness was the only way to open a future without the constant hope that he might return. Meanwhile, the larger war moved on. The Red Ball Express had become an emblem of American logistical might, long convoys that ran 24 hours a day to push supplies toward an advancing front. Engineers laid cables and pipelines underseas. The Pluto pipelines, an extraordinary feat of engineering, carried fuel across the channel, less glamorous than frontline exploits, but decisive in their contribution. These systems removed the dependence on local capture and made seizure of single depots like Hansfeld episodic rather than determinative. For the German units that had been counting on seized fuel for survival, the failure to convert such finds into strategic gain was devastating. They had gambled on a war of maneuver fed by local resources and found themselves outpaced by an economy that could produce and move fuel at scale. The result was a kind of mechanical cruelty. Tanks left with open hatches, engines silent but intact, a pile of unopened jerry cans within sight like a feast behind glass. On a dim evening months after the burial, Anna burned a candle by his photograph. The flame trembled, and she read a letter she had kept folded, a postal card, a joke scratched in an anxious hand, a line about rivers and nights. She had read it 100 times. The lines had started to feel like clothes, familiar and worn thin. Her life proceeded in small economies: the price of bread, the timing of coal deliveries, the careful use of a single dress for Sunday services. The community moved in prescribed steps around her loss. There were whispers sometimes about remaking a life. There were forms and legal notices that required her signature. The state, efficiently bureaucratic, reduced a human life to boxes on a file. And yet the human mind is not only a register of losses, it preserves possibility like contraband. For many families of the missing, hope and ritual coexisted uneasily.
Anna visited the grave at times less to mourn than to confirm facts, that he had been there, that the name etched in stone matched the man she remembered. Inside, a small finger of resentment grew toward the state that had moved so quickly to list him as dead, and the neighbors who had learned to stop asking. Back on the European landscape, American logistics deliberately created a surplus that could be sensibly, if painfully, destroyed. The military calculation was brutal in a utilitarian sense. Quantity could be sacrificed to prevent shifts of advantage. To watch fuel burn is to see economics turned into spectacle. To breathe the acrid smoke is to experience the moment where strategy becomes tactile. For soldiers who watched their salvation go up in flames, it complicated the perception of the enemy. They had hoped to recoup what they lacked. Instead, they saw a foe willing to consume its own stores to deny them the same. Later interrogations recorded a bitter irony. When German soldiers encountered such abundance on the Allied side, some reported being stunned, not only by the quantity, but by the indifference to the waste of it. One quartermaster's note in an interrogation file described a German officer's disbelief that an army so rich in resources would set fire to them rather than accept their tactical cost. The record does not moralize, it simply notes the psychological effect. Those testimonies are part of the archival scaffolding that supports our understanding of supply as a weapon. Between the maps and the field reports sits a human center of gravity, the soldier whose burial in a quiet village anchors this story. He is a composite. Elements of his service record, the likely circumstances of his disappearance, the brass fact formalities of notification, and the emotional contours of a family left behind are stitched together from many real cases. He left a small trunk in a shed. He left a photograph with the corners worn. He left behind a ledger of repairs for a bicycle and a promise in a letter to write more when things settle. None of this is contrived to titillate. It is ordinary. It is how absence is usually filed. As the months turned to years, Anna learned to speak of him in the past tense without the tremor that comes when a wound is fresh. She learned to hear the clack of the oven and associate it with routine rather than anticipation. Yet memory is a living thing. At unexpected moments, it steps forward. An empty chair at breakfast, the echo of a laugh in a telephone call that never came, the way her children, if she had them, flinched at uniforms in passing.
These small remnant reactions reinforced the status of death in the community's mind. The war, of course, did not leave such private tragedies untouched by larger processes. Files are opened and closed in bureaucracies. Missing in action becomes presumed dead after a statutory period. Pensions are adjusted, leases alter hands, and names enter registries.
The transformation from absence to certified loss is a social mechanism, but it also has legal and personal consequences. Remarriage, property settlements, the psychological permission to move on. The family learned to live in the cracks these mechanisms left. But memory, even when arranged formally into dates and laws, keeps its private seasons. Anna's story is one among many of women who pivoted into new roles because history required it. In towns across the country, forms of resilience were adopted. Some became community leaders. Others quietly managed households. The public narrative of victory and liberation rarely pauses to measure the quiet economy of those who remained behind and assumed the work of preserving life and meaning. In the winter decades later, there is a small, almost cinematic moment. A neighbor stops by with a basket of bread. They chat about the ledger of the parish. They remark with that civility people use to shore up their own secret misgivings that time moves even as names stay carved in stone. Anna nods. She has started to grow used to the oddness of living a life that has to be simultaneously present and in the past. Back in the military narrative, units that had once hoped to find sustenance in captured stock were forced to confront a harsher arithmetic. It is one thing to discover a cache. It is another to have the trucks, the spare parts, the protected routes, and the fuel itself necessary to translate that cache into sustained mobility. Americans had organized a logistical system that by late 1944 increasingly made such finds less pivotal. Pluto pipelines under the channel and the round-the-clock runs of supply convoys meant that strategic weight had shifted from local luck to industrial output. The German offensive, remarkable in its initial ferocity, could not be sustained without those broader systems. The result was opposition that sputtered when its fuel did. For men caught in that spiral, the tragedy was immediate and mundane. A soldier slumped against a tank, his breath fogging in air sharp as glass, could be pinned by hypothermia or infection because nothing could move him to a field hospital. The abandonment of equipment, of tanks, of trucks, created landscapes of metallic stillness that would later be photographed and archived as evidence of misfortune rather than of heroism. The images are telling. Opened hatches, weapons idle, a boot frozen in place. In homes like Anna's, processed images of war arrived in newspapers and in newsreels, but they did so with the gentle detachment of distance. People saw the photographs and nodded, and only later, when the ring of the telephone fractured the quiet, did those images become a new kind of personal argument. The public facts of supply and fire and immobilized columns belonged to the record. The private facts of a missing husband belonged to Anna's ledger. Time, which is both a healer and an eraser, moved people into different shapes. Children grew older and began to leave the house. The sense of being anchored in grief was gradually shared and diluted by the ordinary demands of surviving. But legal declarations are not the same as internal acceptance. A certified death could signal to the world that closure had been achieved. But inside the narrow rooms of memory, the possibility remained, like a latent ember. Not enough heat to change anything, but still capable of lighting when provoked. That provocation came in the form of a telephone call late one winter night, 2 decades after the burial. The ring was ordinary, the electric insistence of a machine. But to people in houses built on the grammar of absence, a ring can mean reconfiguration. The voice on the line would not match the photograph on the mantel. It would be time-altered. It would be older, perhaps fibrillated by the miles the speaker had traveled and the things he had seen. That voice might be explaining survival, or giving reasons, or asking for forgiveness. It might be an imposter who had learned the family's names and chosen a cruel joke. Or it might be truth,
voiced with the weary accuracy of someone whose past has become a sort of exile. Before the ring, there is a silence in which everyday details accumulate. Anna has gone to bed, leaving a cup of tea on the sideboard. Her son, a boy now grown, turns the page of a magazine and hears the distant clatter of the city outside. There is a domestic choreography to this late hour. The kettle, the lull in the coal stove, the hiss of the radio left playing softly for background. In such an ordinary frame, history intrudes in an extraordinary way. We stop here, in the space just before the phone's next ring, to consider what has already been said. A world in which industrial abundance and logistical mastery reshaped the fates of nations, and a household that learned to live with a legislated absence. Both arcs, the macro and the micro, have moved in parallel, and both have consequences that cannot be reduced to statistics. If this episode is connecting with you, if the human side of these logistics intrigues you as much as the strategic, subscribe for more deep dive stories that bring archival fact and personal consequence into one frame. We will return to the call and to the question it forces: what happens when a life officially closed reopens at the other end of a long line? The telephone begins to ring again, this time nearer. The sound is simple and obscene in its ability to undo 2 decades of tidy acceptance. In the room, a photograph catches the lamplight. A sleeve on a coat lies as if waiting for a hand that has not returned. Outside, snow presses the windows into silence. The ring insists. The story waits at the lip of revelation, where the weight of wartime logistics and the fragile economies of grief meet and wrestle for what will come next.
The telephone kept ringing until Anna, fingers numb from the cold and from a lifetime of small, careful gestures, lifted the receiver. The wire hummed faintly. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows like a second silence. For a moment, she only heard the late-night city, a distant tram bell, the crisp slap of a boot on a damp pavement. Then a voice, weathered through years and distance, came into the small room. "Mrs. Anders?" the voice asked. It was tentative, not unfamiliar and not entirely strange. This is Sam Reed. I think I knew your husband." Anna's hand tightened. There was a name that fit the man in the photograph, and there was a voice that did not. She let the word that had become a fact for 2 decades sit on her tongue like a hot stone. "You?" she asked, the brittle control in her voice something she had learned to use for the household accounts and for dealing with clerks. "Sam Reed. I served with him. The voice stumbled as if through the years. I thought he was dead too. Then the voice steadied into a line that did what lines do. It created agency. "I'm calling from London. I'm alive." For a second, the room contracted. The photograph on the mantel, the flag folded into its box, the ledger of coal stubs, they all seemed to breathe. The son, who had been sitting at the table turning a page, froze in a posture that was both adolescent and older. The neighbor across the hall, in the habit of dropping by with jars of preserves, paused on the stair. Voices ran like a current through small social grids. One ring could alter them. "What is this?" the son said softly. He had been taught to measure hope for its likely return rate and to hedge disappointment with practical questions. He looked toward his mother for permission to do what sons do, to step forward. Anna's reply was a sound between laugh and cry. "How do I know you're not—" she began, then stopped, because the other man, the voice she had just named, supplied a detail that made the kitchen air tilt. "Tell me about a photograph," he said, almost urgent. "The one with frost on the collar. He put a coin in the corner when he sent it, to stop it from curling." Anna's hand went to the frame, fingers finding the corner where a coin had once been tucked. She had taken it out the first winter, because the metal had rusted the paper. She had kept the coin in a matchbox under the drawer. She had not told anyone. The neighbor who had seen her take it had assumed ritual. The son looked at his mother with the sudden, sharp question of a person who has been given an unexpected ledger entry to reconcile. "How do you know that?" Anna asked. There was a pause long enough for 100 small domestic noises to reassert themselves, a kettle settling, someone downstairs coughing. "I had his photograph," the man said. "I carried it when we were pinned at a roadblock. It kept me from thinking only of cold." The voice was not a confession.
It was a shard of possible truth. The family did what families do when confronted with a fracture in their neat world. They tested the edges. The son asked about dates. He asked about a rank. The voice answered with details that could have been culled from papers, from common knowledge, from myth. He spoke of the Ardennes, of a village where engines had stopped, of the smell of fuel in a way that named both memory and archive. He said that in the chaos after the push slowed, men had been separated and records had been lost. He said with a kind of weary apology that he had tried without success to find them for years. Throughout, there was a historian's caution in the narrative frame. In the post-war decades, a great and well-documented bureaucratic machinery processed names, deaths, and returns. Some men, because of paperwork errors, because of being misidentified, because of shifting borders and the mass movements of populations, remained untraced for years. Others were repatriated, but could not be located by the still fragile communication systems that connected rural households to government offices. Men turned up in cities they had never intended to visit, with names altered by clerks or by their own choices. None of this is miraculous. It is human systems failing under the pressure of catastrophe. On the line, Sam, if Sam he truly was, offered fragments. He said that after the battle he had been cut off with a small group and separated from his company. He spoke of being taken in by a German unit, not as a guest, not as any gentle wartime story, but as a captured man given over to a tenuous survival. He spoke of nights where the teeth of hunger were as loud as guns, of being moved along roads that sometimes cut into eastern zones and sometimes into no man's lands where authority was a rumor. He mentioned an accident that had left him with a wound in the shoulder and a fever that made his name slip away like a borrowed word. He confessed, in a line that spoke of shame rather than need, that he had not written because he had been afraid of upsetting the life she had rebuilt. He said that he had sent a letter once, in 1949, that never reached the right postmark. He said that sometimes a man thinks staying away is the only kindness he can offer those who have learned to breathe again. The story was thin in places. The family pressed for specifics and received evasions. They asked for a witness, someone who could corroborate events. He named a few likely places where men had been held: a transit point in northern Germany, a work camp in the Ruhr where conditions had been brutal, but where a small map of one's own person could still be drawn. The family asked if he had any papers. He said no, either destroyed, lost, or handed by him to another man who promised to look after them and never did. Skepticism in a social pocket like this one is a refuge. The son suggested calling the authorities. The neighbor suggested writing everything down.
Anna, who had learned to measure the currency of both hope and shame, asked the only question that mattered in a life arranged around tidy certainties. If you are him, why call now? The voice hesitated. Because I found one of his things, he said finally. A name carved into a handle, something I have watched in a dozen hands and never given a thought to until now. And because a man gets older and he needs to set records as much for himself as for anyone else. And because I have been carrying his face for 20 years, and it has been a weight. The call ended with the kinds of arrangements grief and caution script for themselves. He said he would come if they wanted him. He suggested meeting not in the village, but at a station an hour away. He gave a number in London and the name of a veterans charity that had helped him. He promised paperwork. He promised identification. He asked for nothing from Anna but the permission to appear in a place where he could be tested by the light of ordinary human scrutiny. After the receiver was replaced, the kitchen became a small tribunal. The son paced. The neighbors sat down too hard and apologized. The ledger on the table seemed suddenly thinner than memory. Anna folded her hands as if to hold together something fragile. Her breath came in little soft rustles. She had built a life around the social fact of death. To recategorize the man as alive would demand changes: practical, emotional, legal. The pension would be affected. The parish entries would need adjustment. There would be conversations that would convene in rooms with more witnesses and fewer mercies. Word moved fast. In a village where everyone's life intersected, a phone call became a public event. A church warden knocked gently on Anna's door to ask whether a congregation should prepare for an arrival. A cousin phoned from a neighboring town. Someone called the local paper out of a mix of civic duty and the craving to see a small human drama resolved on the printed page. A clergyman advised caution. A neighbor insisted on charity of belief. These were the routines of a small community trying to handle a rupture. Over the following days, the family dug out the files they had kept in that polite, dutiful way that bureaucracies require. There were telegram copies, a certificate stamped by an office that had relied on military returns, the name in a ledger. The son called the number the man had left and spoke, at length, to a woman who worked for a veterans group. She confirmed the man's existence on their rolls: a soldier listed as missing, then as presumed dead, then as a returned casualty who had been processed but unlocated. Her tone was the kind of official compassion that recognizes the pattern of the late return and has seen its consequences before.
She said the man's papers were thin. She said post-war registries were messy. She said she would be willing to help coordinate a meeting.
A meeting was set for a station cafe, neutral ground, the sort of public place that provides both witness and safe exit routes. The family arrived early, as if timing might create a certainty where history had not. Anna smoothed a handkerchief between her fingers. Her son kept glancing at the door. The neighbor sat with a cup of tea and practiced calm. When he arrived, the man, if this man was indeed the soldier in the photograph, moved with a gait changed by time and by some weather inside him. He was not a theatrical figure. He was the accumulation of years. His face had lines that made new contours of bone. He carried himself as if he had been taught to answer to his own shadow. He extended a cautious hand. The son, who had been calculating details since the first call, rose and looked at him like someone comparing an old footprint to new snow. He brought with him small proofs, a name stitched into a frayed undershirt, a ration card with a smudged ink stamp, a photograph of a different group with a handwriting on the back, an initial that matched the soldier's. These were not incontrovertible evidences, they were remnant things. And yet they had a quality of items that attract belief. They were detailed, ordinary, and not fashioned for a scene. The man spoke haltingly about the years in between. He told a story that was plausible in outline and spare on flourish. Capture, movement between camps, an injury, a death in a mass transit, the collapse of order in certain sectors at the war's end, and then a slow pathway through camps for displaced persons, people living as if suspended between countries and not yet belonging to any. He explained a period of silence in the early 1950s when many men, stateless or shadowed by paperwork, found themselves without names that the world's registrars would accept. He said he had worked odd jobs, changed a few names to slip through borders, and then in the 1960s began to find organizations that helped veterans reconnect. He said he had looked often for his friends for any trace and had found none until recently, when a detail, an artifact with a name, rekindled the possibility of returning to the only human land that had been lost to him. His voice carried a common post-war note, regret folded with practical explanation. He spoke of guilt. He admitted shame at seeing the life Anna had made without him and at possibly undoing it. He expressed a desire not to disrupt but to correct records, and if allowed, to meet whoever wished to meet him. There were immediate practical tensions. The son asked about money, what was to be done about the pension, the small savings that had been built on the assumption of death. The neighbor, who had listened to the man's hands as he spoke, looked at Anna and did not know what to recommend. The clergyman, summoned after the small meeting, counseled mercy.
The local registrar warned of legal procedures. A certificate of death could be rescinded, inheritance matters could be reopened, property could revert. Townspeople debated whether what the man described was likely, and newspapers prepared to report a story that would attract readers. A man declared dead decades before, suddenly walking back into a village's life. But the emotional economy was less fixable than the legal one. The son, who had been a boy at his father's funeral, then became the de facto male presence in the household. To accept the man as alive would reassign roles that had ossified. Anna felt the tug between relief and an anger so private it could not be named, at the world that allowed such a thing to happen, at the man for not having written, and at whatever infrastructure of chaos had broken the lines of communication. Her feelings arrived as fragments, some days a fierce hope, other days a quiet refusal. The man, Sam, sensed this. He did not demand an embrace. He requested only a measure of truth. He allowed himself to be photographed by the local paper, if only at the edges, so that there might be proof of personhood. He consented to meeting the registrar. He agreed to counsel if Anna wished. He accepted that the village might require time. As the small community wrestled, the historian's voice offered context. It was not uncommon for the post-war decade to produce such late returns or claims. The flood of bodies, the smudged records, the relocation of borders, and the long, erratic movement of displaced persons created a fog through which names often disappeared. Some returns were joyful, others fractious. Social reintegration was never purely a matter of legalities. People had remade themselves in the absence of those taken from them. Wives had remarried, households had been reconstituted, communities had adapted their rituals. To reintegrate was to risk disrupting fragile domestic architectures. There was, too, the question of identity. War can displace more than bodies. It can dislodge the self. Men who survived sometimes did so by deliberately altering the parts of themselves that tied them to trauma. Names could be abandoned like old clothes. Some survivors were ashamed. Some feared rejection.
Some had simply lost time to an existence that did not keep records. The man's explanation sat in this cluster of reasons, not miraculous, not implausible, but the product of a messy history. In the weeks that followed, the community learned to live with the uncertain presence. The man came back and forth on arranged visits. He helped fix a leaky roof in return for a cup of tea. He became a figure both of curiosity and of awkward domestic negotiation. The son watched him with a caution that had the edge of a stranger measuring the status of belonging. The neighbors sometimes brought extra potatoes for dinners and sometimes judged the man in the quiet ways neighbors do. Anna herself navigated a different order of truth.
There were nights when she sat by the stove and imagined the man in the photo as a shadow returning to stand behind her. There were other nights when she would walk to the grave to see his name carved in stone and imagined what it would be like to disturb that slow permanence. The grave, once a truth and now a curious object, became an emblem of history's tendency to legislate finality where life had not cooperated. In the parish ledger, the official entry was crossed and annotated. At home, she kept his photograph in the same frame, postured as if accepting that one human fact could allow two contradictory realities to coexist. The broader implications of such returns were not merely personal. For officials and historians, late claims forced a re-examination of the mechanisms that turn absence into legal death, an act that is as much administrative as it is moral. It raised the question of what social obligations are owed to those who have been legally erased and then reappear. The state must balance fiscal realities with human need. Communities must balance compassion with the practicalities of life lived through absence. The man's presence also reopened conversations about culpability and memory. He spoke once, starkly and without rhetorical flourish, about the engines that had died in the Ardennes and about the fuel piles that had burned so that an enemy might not find them. He said that his problem had not been simple memory. It had been the knowledge that a war's arithmetic could render both abundance and ruin in a single breath. He spoke of men left in snow because there were no transport arteries to carry them. He spoke of the worker who watched fuel flare and wondered at the stranger logic that had created such spectacle. He did not offer moral nuance as a defense. He presented observation. For Anna, the oil smell comparisons mattered less than the outline of the man who had sat at her table. As the village adjusted, so did the man. He registered with the local authorities, filled out forms that asked him to sign the same name he had once used as a boy, and found that the act of writing his name in an official ink was in itself an elegy. He visited a doctor who confirmed wounds that had become permanent small weights on his body. He saw a counselor who taught him how to speak without the armor of silence about what it was like to live in the borderlands of identity. More than once, the question of verification returned. A distant cousin produced a scrap of correspondence that seemed to indicate a name the man had used in a band of displaced persons. A veterans charity in London offered a note from a camp register that suggested a similar path. No piece of evidence was decisive, but the accumulation of small congruences tended, in common human ways, toward acceptance. Not everyone conceded.
A handful insisted on the possibility of fraud. Others whispered that it was easier to dismiss the man than to reopen the ledger of their own precarious grief. In public, the village used ritual to come to terms. The church scheduled a small, informal reconciliation service, not to claim theological absolution, but to provide a space to name things and to allow community members to speak. At that service, Anna stood and read a passage, short sentences about memory and responsibility. She did not dramatize. She spoke in the voice of a woman who had learned to measure things not by grand pronouncements, but by the daily test of bread and coal. She offered no sweeping forgiveness, and she asked for none. She asked only for the space to decide what to do next with the man who had reappeared. The man listened from the back of the church, hands folded. He did not demand to be forgiven. He seemed to understand that some of the debts of friendship or marriage are not paid by return, but by the gentler currencies of continuity. Showing up, performing care, accepting the consequences. In time, the pension issue was adjudicated. Some monies were recalculated, modest and mean in the context of broader state expenditures. Legal forms were amended. The community, in its quiet way, adapted.
In the final weeks of the narrative that binds individual life to the machinery of war, the historian's voice gathers up the moral threads. The discovery at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons, was a moment that dramatized the paradox this program has traced, that abundance and scarcity can coexist in the same theater, and that the mechanics of supply decide more battles than a single act of courage. It is worth recalling that the lines where fuel was burned and supply convoys ran were places where strategy met the raw arithmetic of survival. They were also places where individual lives were made and unmade by the capacity or failure of movement. Anna's story and the man's return are a particular instance of a larger truth. War operates not only through bullets and banners, but by the quiet vectors of supply and paperwork. The burning of fuel depots, the abandonment of serviceable tanks, and the immobilization of units were all consequences of a war that increasingly ran on industrial inputs rather than local capture. In turn, the human consequences of these processes, the people left behind, the records misfiled, the men who never reached home until long after the smoke had cleared, compose the longer tale of conflict that remains poorly registered in victory parades. We end as we began, with a small, sharp image. Anna at the grave, one hand on the cold stone, the other gripping the matchbox where a coin had been kept for 20 years. The man who had been declared dead now sits at the kitchen table, in a room where the clock ticks with careful attention. He is not a miraculous return. He is a human being remade by history's rough hands. He brings with him neither triumph nor a neat reconciliation. He brings instead questions, the kind that do not have tidy answers, about truth and forgiveness, about what we owe one another when the world ceases to keep careful accounts. Before we close, it is essential to repeat the program's clarifying note. The intimate family story presented in this segment is a fictionalized composite, created to explore the human consequences of documented events during the Ardennes campaign and its aftermath. Archival facts, dates, and quotations used in the historical exposition are drawn from source material. The personal narrative, names, conversations, and private scenes has been dramatized to reflect typical experiences of the era and is not a record of a single real person's life. If this story moved you, you can find a list of the primary sources and archival materials that informed our historical account in the description below. We draw on wartime intelligence reports, quartermaster logs, and post-war interrogation records to reconstruct the logistical picture of December 1944 and the months that followed. For more episodes that combine archival fact with human consequence, subscribe and follow our series. The winter light in the village thins. A train moves in the distance, neither promise nor judgment, only motion. On a small table, the telephone waits, still. In a corner of the room, the photograph stares out, its corners softened by time. 2 decades of absence have been rearranged by a single ring. The record in the parish office is altered, not erased. The man who called is here, subject to the ordinary tests of neighbors, law, and memory. He will not restore what was lost, nor will his presence fully resolve the moral questions that arise when an industrial war measures life in barrels and boxes. But in his slow steps back into the world, we see another consequence of the war's arithmetic, that abundance burned to prevent advantage and scarcity that immobilized armies both map onto human lives whose names sometimes reappear on the other side of long absences. His family buried his body in 1944. Then, 20 years later, he called.